Okay, as we continue our descent from the top of the cortex down to the bottom of the spinal cord, we're finally passing this tentorium cerebelli layer. So we're descending from the supratentorial structures down into the infratentorial structures. In first stop, really to talk about is the brainstem. Except it's not, right? We really can't get into the brainstem until we talk about the cranial nerves, because so much of the brainstem really has to do with the cranial nerves. I would say that's the most important thing about the brainstem. So as we look, this is an inferior to superior view of the brain. The numbering is kind of reasonable, right? So this is on the anterior side, and then we're moving kind of from the anterior to the posterior and the superior down to the inferior a little bit, right? But like 1, 2, 3, etc., all the way down to 11 and 12. A better way to organize them, though, is the rule of fours. So the rule of fours says there's going to be 4 cranial nerves in the medulla, 4 in the pons, and 4 above the pons, right? So that we're very specific with the language there, because that means there's actually 2 in the midbrain, and then there's also going to be 2 in, not really in the thalamus, but coming off of the thalamus and in the limbic system and whatnot. So the olfactory bulb goes to the limbic system. The optic nerve goes right into the thalamus and the lateral geniculate nucleus. Then we have 3 and 4 in the midbrain, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the pons. Now, there's going to be a little bit of overlap. Trigeminal nerve is really big. It's going to kind of go all over. Cranial nerve 8 is right on the cusp, a little bit in the pons, a little bit in the medulla. That's going to be important for strokes later when we're looking at the pica and the aorta strokes. And then we have 9, 10, 11, and 12. On top of this, anything divisible by 12 is going to be midline. So that's like, 3, 4, 6, 12, and anything not is going to be on the lateral side. So we'll more in the rule of fours later, but this is definitely this is a must know. All right, starting with the olfactory bulb. So it projects from olfactory foramina on the cribriform plate, which is itself part of the ethmoid bone. And it's the one sensory nerve that doesn't go straight to the thalamus, right? It doesn't go through the thalamus. It goes through the limbic lobe. And people argue that this is why it might be important for, you walk into a house, you smell something, you go, it reminds me of my grandma or something, right? That's why, arguably. Here's a fun picture. And here's a fun picture as well, going through these the foramina of this cribriform plate on the ethmoid bone. Optic nerve. So this is all afferent incoming information. So we have the optic nerve, which goes the optic chiasm. Some of it goes ipsilaterally, some of it goes contralaterally. And note that the pituitary bulb is right there. So again, it goes optic nerve to chiasm. After this, though, so it splits. Some of it stays ipsa, some of it goes contra. Now it's the optic tract, which goes through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and sometimes some of the reflexes go to the superior colliculi. Sometimes we don't, and don't worry so much about when we do and when we don't. We then go through either the dorsal, sometimes known as Baum's, we'll talk about that, or the Meyer occipital radiation. So we go from a tract to a radiation, and then we go to the occipital lobe for, or that's our destination for visual processing. So let's go ahead and just take a look as we move through this. Optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract, lateral geniculate nucleus, superior colliculi, occipital lobe. Not shown are the dorsal and Meyer occipital radiations, because I think they're just too thin. All right, so there's going to be a lot of crisscrosses, right? I think I labeled like till 4 or 5, and then it's overkill. In all of neuro, there's just so much crisscrossing, so much decussation that you really just got to keep track of it. They love to ask these questions because they're hard. So everything in the left visual field is going to go to the basically right part of the brain. Everything in the right visual field is going to go to the left part of the brain. But it's a little bit more complicated, because if you imagine the left visual field here, some of it is going to go to the nasal retinal fibers. These are the ones that are going to go through the optic chiasm and cross. Now the part over here that's getting the temporal retinal fibers is getting the right visual field. That's actually going to stay ipsilateral and move down. So these tracks are going to be some of the ipsilateral side and some from the contralateral side. If you imagine this is like an intersection, though, it should make sense that the nasal fibers would be the one to cross, because they don't have to cut across as much traffic as it would be if it was a temporal fiber that's crossing. We said that after the lateral geniculate nucleus, we get these optic radiations, which are going to go to the parietal lobe, and these Meyers, which are going to go to the temporal lobe. And some people call this Baum's loop, but there's kind of an interesting article about how no one actually knows where the term Baum's loop came in some article publication just mentioned Baum's loop, and everybody copied that article, and people copied the articles that copy that, and somehow it spread like wildfire. It's this kind of weird meme, and it doesn't actually mean anything. No one actually, it's kind of made up. So I wonder if I put in one of my lectures like the Cartonis lobe, and somehow it proliferates and it becomes a thing. But it's kind of like the Caesar salad, right? Caesar didn't eat salad, somehow that became named after him. But again, Meyer is going to go temporal, and optics going to go more parietal, and that's going to be important when we're looking at lesions. So the left part of the brain is the right visual field, and so everything's opposite. Same thing here. When we go to the upper dorsal optic radiation, it's going to actually be the lower part of the visual field, and the lower Meyer tracts are going to be the upper visual field. So let's talk a little bit more about the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm, as we said, is sitting right next to the pituitary gland, which is sitting in the sella turcica right here. Oculomotor. So the oculomotor is really just, it's in the name, oculo, eyes, motor, muscles. So this is, it's coming from the midbrain, right? So remember 1 and 2 are technically not from the brain stem, but 3 through 12 are, with kind of the exception of 11. So this is all of the muscles of the eyes coming from the midbrain. Again, we remember 2-2-4-4 rule of force. So here's all of the different eye movements we can deal with, and most of them actually are going to be the oculomotor. So when in doubt, it's the oculomotor that's doing things. We're going to go through all of these. So superior rectus is going to pull it up. The inferior oblique pulls it kind of up and medially. The inferior oblique pulls it up immediately. Inferior rectus just pulls it down, and the medial rectus pulls it medially. Ptosis, so the oculomotor, also the levator palpebrae superioris, is going to really just keep this eyelid pulled back. So that's a functioning oculomotor, and this is not a functioning. So you're going to have this ptosis, the drooping eyelid, if you have a problem with your oculomotor nerve. Notice that you can also get this if you have Horner syndrome and an issue with sympathetic innervation of the face. And that's because originating off of the levator palpebrae superioris is the superior tarsal plate, which is supplied by the sympathetic nervous system. So you can actually get a similar phenotype here. So the oculomotor nerve in our midbrain is right next to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which has a bunch of parasympathetic fibers which are going to innervate the pupil for constriction. And so these travel kind of in a bundle here. The oculomotor is going to be on the inside, the deep part, and the parasympathetic nerves are going to be in the periphery. The oculomotor is going to go ahead and supply all of these muscles. And that one, and the parasympathetic is going to help constrict the pupils in response to light. So we have a nice picture here. So imagine if you had ischemia, right? You're severe diabetic, or hypoperfusion, or hypertension, or for whatever reason you can't get adequate blood flow. The parasympathetic nervous system, right, to the pupils to constrict is actually going to be fine, because the blood's coming from outside and going in, and so this is going to be less likely to become ischemic. This is more likely to become ischemic. So you should have an issue with your eye muscle movements, but the pupillary dilation constriction should be fine. On the other hand, if I have a tumor, the tumor potentially could be the opposite. It could just hit the pupil, and then you have a pupil issue. But actually more likely that if you have a big tumor, it's going to hit both. But so that's a really important thing, is that a tumor is going to hit both, or just the parasympathetic, while ischemia is going to hit both, or just the oculomotor on the inside, because it's deeper, it's more distal from the blood supply. So if there's a lot going on here. So we see cranial nerve 3 popping out over there. This is very susceptible to saccular aneurysms next to the posterior communicating artery. So here we're looking kind of at the circle Willis, which we'll talk about later, but you get a lot of saccular aneurysms here, also known as berry aneurysms, because they kind of look like a berry. Sometimes they're called saccular aneurysms because they kind of look like a sac. And if these rupture, if there's a hemorrhage here, you're going to get a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And often, again, in the PCOM, this is going to go ahead and damage the cranial nerve 3. And so, boom, and that would damage cranial nerve 3. Again, technically, it's going to hit the parasympathetic first, but likely it's going to hit both of them. You could also damage the oculomotor nerve if you have an uncal herniation. So if you have some sort of hematoma and there's a mass effect and there's a lot of pressure pushing this way, you could have a tentorial herniation, and we know that right at the bottom of the tentorium is this third cranial nerve, which could get damaged. We mentioned the Edinger-Westphal parasympathetic innervation on the periphery. This is going to be for pupillary constriction. These are the sphincter muscles. You also have dilator radial muscles, which are going to be sympathetic. So there's a pupillary reflex if light comes into your eye. So if light comes in, it's going to move through your eye via your afferent optic nerve 2. It's going to go to the pretectal area in the posterior of the midbrain. It then moves to both Edinger, the ipsilateral and contralateral Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is going ahead and send efferent fibers outwards via these parasympathetic ganglia, which are going to run alongside the oculomotor nerve, and they are going to activate the constrictor sphincter muscles to close the pupil. Because if you're shining a light in your eye, you don't need that much light. So constricting is the smart move. Here's just a cool little thing. We go to the pretectal nucleus, then it goes in the Edinger-Westphal, and then it goes back out, and it's going to cause constriction. So there's the light reflex, but you have a similar constriction reflex. So here's your light reflex, right? That's constricted. This one's not. But if you bring like a pen close to your face, anything close to your face, your pupils are also going to constrict there. And the idea is you want to minimize these widely, as you bring something really close to your face, you're getting widely diverging rays. And those are going to hit the sides of your retina. It's going to confuse your brain. So by constricting, you're going to allow less diverging light to come in. Similarly, your eyes, your medial rectus muscles are going to kick into gear, and by moving inwards, we're also going to direct the light to the back of the retina rather than the periphery of the retina. So you're going to have less diverging rays. And on top, so that's number 2. And number 3 is you're going to activate your ciliary muscles, contract it. And when you contract them, so here's our lens. If this is something far away, we're not contracting. We have a very thin lens, and so it doesn't really converge much. But because something is far away, these lines are mostly parallel, so we don't really need to converge them that much. But if something's really close, again, we have diverging rays, and we try to we try to literally accommodate for this by constricting the pupils, medial rectus kicking in. But we're also going to want a super fat lens so that we can hyper converge these diverging rays. So that again, we still have everything hit right at the retina, which is what we want. Trochlear nerve, this is coming from the midbrain, but it's actually coming from the back of the midbrain. It's like, I think the only cranial nerve that I can think of that really comes from the posterior aspect. So it's going to loop around a little bit. It controls, so I think of SO4 because it controls the superior oblique. Inferior oblique, most of these muscles make sense except the superior and inferior oblique. So really just to hit home, the superior oblique, it's the superior oblique muscle, but it does the opposite of what it says. It's going to bring it inferiorly. Now it also brings it medially. So just commit this to memory. Superior oblique is going to bring your eye down and in. That's cranial nerve 4. Inferior oblique is the oculomotor. This is going to bring your muscle in your eye in and up. And so this trochlear nerve is going to be useful if you're reading a book or you're walking down the stairs, because you kind of have to bring your eyes inwards and down to do both of those things. The trigeminal nerve, so this is coming from the pons now, the rule of 4s, right? We had 1 and 1, 1 and 2 is above. Just 2 and 3 is going to be the midbrain now. 4, 5, 6, 7, arguably 8 are going to be now in the pons. So mostly sensory, and it's really 3 nerves for the price of 1, since the name tri. And V1 is just going to be the ophthalmic to the forehead and the eyes. 2 is going to be maxillary to the kind of the teeth and lower part of the nose, and then the mandibular is going to be to the muscles of mastication in your jaw and whatnot. So here we have the ophthalmic distribution. Here we have the maxillary distribution. And here we have the mandibular distribution. Again, we said mostly sensory, but there is some mastication, some efferent motor neurons involved in the trigeminal nerve as well. It's also going to innervate the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. So specifically, it's going to be your, this says lingual nerve, sensory. Maybe ignore what this says. Don't ignore this. Sensory in the sense that, like, if you're eating something really hot, that's what your trigeminal nerve is going to pick up on, your mandibular V3 nerve. So not does it taste good, not does it taste bad, just is it hot or cold, or is there something there? So yeah, sensory in that sense of the word. Abducens, abduct. It's going to abduct your eyes. This is also coming from the pons, and boom, this is going to pull your eye out into the side. It's abducting. The facial nerve, it's going to kind of be the opposite of the cranial nerve 5 in a couple of ways. It's the motor. efferent to most of your face. It's also going to supply a lot of the glands, except for your parotid, which is kind of ironic because it actually moves through the parotid, and for whatever reason, it doesn't innervate that. Also plays a role as the stapedius muscle is innervated by this. The stapedius muscle is going to help with your the stapes and the ossicle bones in your middle ear, and it's going to help regulate sound. Also now not the so like kind of sense was the V3, but this is now taste. Oh, this is too sweet. This is too bitter. That is going to be the facial nerve. So here we're just seeing a dumb picture. There you go. Proof. It goes right through the parotid gland. More proof. It goes through the parotid gland, but it does not innervate the parotid gland. It innervates most of the other glands, though. And we're kind of see this here specifically as the chordae. The tympani is going to be a downstream derivative, basically a branch of the facial nerve, and it's what's going to supply the taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and certain glands that are going to help with salivation. So again, anterior 2/3 of the tongue's sensory was the cranial nerve 5, but now this is taste. It's cranial nerve 7. So we said it's most of the muscles of the face. It's probably the most important thing about it. There's something like Bell's palsy. And we'll talk about this later, but if you get a Bell's palsy, cranial nerve 7, it's going to be the entire face. If you have an upper cortical stroke, it's actually only going to be the lower part of your face. It's going to spare the forehead. But you're not going to be able to move the temporalis muscle, so you're going to have, it's kind of like you have Botox now. So inability to wrinkle the brow. The orbicularis oculi is useful for closing your eye. And if you can't close your eye, then it's going to kind of be like the opposite of ptosis, where it's going to keep your eye extra open. Inability to puff out your cheeks and smile, so it's causes a drooping of the mouth. And yeah, so if you see somebody with this, it truly is hard to miss. And we mentioned it also innervates the stapedius muscle, which helps regulate the stapes in the middle of the ear. And so if something's wrong here, you're going to have something called hyperacusis, where the sound is going to sound incredibly loud, just like a normal conversation. Vestibulocochlear nerve, this is going to be 2 for the price of 1. So vestibulobalance cochlear is going to be hearing, also coming from the pons, but it's kind of the medulla too. It's a little tricky. And it's going to parallel the facial nerve in a bunch of different ways. This kind of makes sense if you think about the fact that the cranial nerve 7 goes to the stapedius. So cranial nerve 7 has something to do with hearing. So it makes sort of sense that 7 and 8, then being so close to one another, kind of have slightly parallel roles. We see evidence of them paralleling literally the geography right there. But then it's going to bifurcate. And some of it's going to go to the semicircular canals, and some of it's going to go to the cochlea. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Glosso is tongue. Pharyngeal is the pharynx. Again, 2 for the price of 1. So it's going to help with swallowing related activities in the pharynx. And also it's going to pick up on, so we have these carotid bodies in our carotid artery, which are going to have lots of baroreceptors. So if your blood pressure is too high or blood pressure is too low, it's going to send sympathetic or parasympathetic signals to your heart to regulate your stroke volume and whether you have tachycardia or bradycardia, and should we dilate the blood vessels or constrict the blood vessels. So this is going to be picking up blood pressure and helping inform a response. Now this is, again, we have a lot of nerves to the tongue. We have 5 of them. So this is the third one. This is going to the posterior. But this is doing both the sensory and the taste to the posterior aspect of the tongue. So again, the cranial nerve 5 was just the sensory as a hot or cold to the anterior 2/3. Facial was just the taste to the anterior 2/3. This is doing temperature, pain, the sensory, but also the taste to the posterior 1/3. So a gag reflex, if you poke in here, you're gonna gag. You just don't overthink what a gag reflex is. Cranial nerve 9 is going to be the afferent, sending the sensory information in, but then the motor efferent is going to come from cranial nerve 10. So these two things are going to work together for this. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, this is coming from the medulla. This is a lot of roles, parasympathetic to the GI system. Soft pellet elevation, midline uvula. These aren't really that important, but it's going to be really important for diagnostics. We just said it's the afferent cough reflex, and it's going to help with swallowing as well. Because it controls a lot of the muscles, again, that play a role for a gag reflex. And so similarly, it's going to play a role with swallowing as well. So we just said gag reflex, 9 and 10. Palatal reflex, though, is just going to be 10 only, touching the roof of the mouth and watching it go up. You're in a picnic, parasympathetic nervous system, you want to digest your food, your vagus nerve is going to help with this. And The recurrent laryngeal nerve is actually going to branch off of this, go under the aortic arch, and is going to go up and innervate a lot of your the muscles. You're just helping with your voice box. And so if you have damage to the vagus nerve, this is going to cause hoarseness. And that's going to be really helpful for isolating a type of stroke that you might have. We also have, so cranial nerve 9 got the baroreceptors in the carotid space, but we also have baroreceptors in the aortic space, and cranial nerve 10 is going to pick up on these. So yeah, again, we have the 9, and here we have 10. Accessory nerve. So this comes from the cervical plexus, which makes it a little bit unique, right? It's not actually coming from the brainstem. It's actually coming from cervical plexus a little bit down below. Think like C2, C3, C4, C5. It innervates the sternocleidomastoid muscle for turning the head. So it's originating from these cranial nerves, and it's actually moving up, which is kind of weird. It's moving up. It moves the foramen magnum, and then it goes back down through the jugular foramen, kind of paralleling cranial nerve 8 and 10, which is interesting. So it's the SCMs for turning your head. So this would be the right SCM from the right accessory nerve, helping turn the head to the left. And then we have these trapezius muscles, which are also going to be a little bit innervated by the accessory nerve. Hypoglossal, underglossal tongue. So it's under the tongue is what this is innervating, and but it's largely actually for projecting the tongue forward. So it's going to be most of the motor output for the tongue. So yeah, motor output, a lot of the muscles here. And so we kind of ignored a little bit the vagus nerve in the tongue. I don't think that's so important. So it's the hypoglossus is going to be pushing your tongue out. Very important. And if you have a lesion here, let's say you have a lesion in the left side, you're going to have your tongue is going to bend towards the left. And people remember this by you lick your wounds as your tongue is leaning to the left, because that's the side where the damage is. So reflexes, for the most part, the numbers are always going to be lower. So the corneal reflex, if somebody pokes your eye, you're going to blink. And you're feeling this with V1, the ophthalmic, and you're closing your eye with the orbiculus oculi with cranial nerve 7. The jaw is going to actually be both the V3, the mandibular, for the sensory and the motor. The gag, we said, is 9, and then mostly 10 for the efferent. And then the pupillary, constriction response to light, 2 is going to be the afferent, and then 3 is going to be the efferent. So when in doubt, the lower number is always going to be afferent. So just a little summary. I actually think all of that's really high yield, but if you didn't get any of this, 1 is smell, 2 is afferent, the optic nerve. 3 is going to be efferent, controls most of the muscles. 4 is going to be specifically the superior oblique. Remember, SO4 is how I remember this. And it kind of does the opposite of what it says. The superior actually brings your eye down. And so it's specifically going to be down and in. So you want to read a book, you want to look down the stairs, you need your cranial nerve 4 to be working, the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 5, V1, V2, V3, forehead, middle of the face, lower part of the face, V3, the mandibular, is also going to be playing a role in mastication. 6 is going to be the abductor nerves, pulling your eye out laterally. This is a lot. This is all of the glands except for parotid, which it moves through. It's the stapedius or hyperacusis is going to be a thing, and it's the motor output. So you're going to have Bell's palsy, including the forehead if this is damaged. Also, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for taste for this, and the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for is this hot or cold. Vestibular cochlear is going to be, the vestibular is going to be balanced, cochlear is going to be for hearing. This is going to be for the gag reflex afferent. It's also going to be for the carotid sinuses, baroreceptors. 10 is going to be the vagus nerve, which does a lot of different things. It sends parasympathetic innervation to the GI. It's going to be the efferent part of the gag reflex. Does a whole bunch of things, palate elevation. 11, the accessory nerve, is coming from the cervical plexus, but remember, it goes upwards through the foramen magnum and then goes down through the jugular foramen with everybody else for turning your head, also the trapezius stimulation, and then the tongue pushing out as the hypoglossus is going to be the motor. And I left something out, the cranial nerve 9 is also going to be for the we said the lower part of the the posterior 1/3 of the tongue for the sensory and the taste. So now we looked at the inferior to superior. Now we're looking downwards, eagle eye view. And again, we can kind of see cranial nerves, 1 and 2 all the way down to 12, moving in this particular direction. So actually, it sounds super esoteric, and it is, but you got to know this. So 1 goes through the cribriform plate, 2 goes through the optic canal, superior orbital fissure. This is going to be almost all eye-related stuff, like 3, 4, and 6 are all eyes. Cranial nerve, this V1, this is actually all eyes as well, right? This is the ophthalmic, which is the sensory to the part of the eye part of the face, the upper part of the face. Cranial nerve 2 is the foramen rotundum, and cranial nerve V3 is going to be the ovale. Middle meningeal artery, where the which if you get this ruptured, you can get an epidural hematoma, goes through the spinosum. And then we have all of the ear stuff, 7 and 8, it makes sense, those go together, goes through the auditory meatus, the internal one. And then a bunch of things go through the jugular foramen. We said it's 9, it's 10, and 11 goes upwards through the foramen magnum and then goes down with everybody. But it's called the jugular foramen, so also the jugular vein goes through here. The hypoglossal canal, it's going to be cranial nerve 12, and that is literally, that's its namesake. And then the foramen magnum is, this is where the brainstem is going through. We said the cranial nerve 9 is going to be going up, and then the vertebral arteries are coming through here to form to make the basilar artery.